Welcome to the Samueletini Show, where business, innovation, and sustainability converge to drive progress. Are you ready to uncover solutions shaping our future? Let's dive in.
Welcome to a new episode. Today we are going to discuss again the debate, grow. We are going to discuss how this word has become like a prophecy or one objective. And we do it with somebody that has been at the forefront of post-grow at the Arketa Institute, who is a co-founder. So I'm very pleased to meet us today, Matt Orsagh. Matt, it's such a pleasure to have you at the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
And Matt, we will discuss a bit more about your work and the debate that is in the press, even has become mainstream, post-grow, degrow, and decoupling and others. But before that, can you tell us a brief about you? What is the journey of Matt? Have you entered the ESG movement, and then have you gone into this growth area?
Sure. I guess it's a relatively long journey. I'll try to keep it brief. I'm in my early 50s right now, but I graduated university in the mid 90s. Yeah, I had an English degree and a film degree because of those are the things that I liked. I'm a storyteller and I like stories by nature. And I worked a little bit in the world and realized I should probably go back to school to make myself a little more useful in the world. I went to business school, got a business degree. While I was doing that, my professor was a CFA chartered financial analyst and gave us the curriculum of the CFA Institute. CFA Institute Chartered Financial Analyst is kind of a level above an MBA in finance. If you're dumb enough to want to do more finance after an MBA, that's what it's for. So it's just a certification kind of above what an MBA is. It's global in nature. So I did that. In the meantime, I was in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. That's where my family was. I moved up to New York with my finance degree. I thought that's what you do. It was a bit naive, but it worked out all right. I got my CFA charter in 2003, and I actually joined the CFA Institute itself as an employee in 2005 because they had just started something called the Center for Financial Market Integrity. It was kind of the think tank within CFA Institute. And that appealed to me because it kind of married my storytelling side of things with my new skills in finance. And I did research, writing, and speaking on mostly starting off in corporate governance issues, how companies are run, shareowner rights, those kind of things. Fighting the good fight for free and efficient markets and making sure shareowners had rights. That evolved into the ESG space. If you remember, Principles of Responsible Investment came out 2006. Actually, my first assignment at CFA Institute was to be at those meetings that participate in those meetings that grew into the PRI. I was only one of hundreds of people at those meetings, but that was still kind of where I started. And over the years, my career and understanding of sustainability grew as the sustainability and ESG world grew. But over time, I realized that we weren't really addressing the issues that needed to be addressed in the way they needed to be addressed. We were kind of, the analogy I give is we're painting the house while it's on fire. We need to stop the fire, not paint the house.
Yeah.
But sustainability was making small little tweaks and small little improvements, slightly less, your typical ESG fund would invest slightly less in oil and gas and slightly more in technology. That didn't really change the system that needed to be changed. And so over time, probably the past, 6 to 8 years, I started coming across ecological economics, post-growth, planetary boundaries, those kind of things. And we could talk about what those are, as our conversation goes along. And those are the kind of things that really, they stop and say, look, it's just physics and chemistry when you get down to it. The laws of thermodynamics are in charge. That physics class you took in high school that you didn't like is really what you needed to understand about. There are limits to growth of a planet with finite resources. There's limits, physics and chemistry give us the limits of our world, how we can and can't use what we have. And our economic system ignores that. The neoclassical economics that's kind of dominated the last 50, 60 years pretty much ignores those limits to growth. And that's how we get climate change and other problems of overshoot. And I'll just briefly talk about if people aren't familiar with the planetary boundaries framework. It's something that came out about 15, 16 years ago. And it looks at our 9 different natural systems that are really our life support system on Earth. One of them's climate. There's, land use, water use. Novel entities is one, which is mostly just plastics in places we don't want it to be. And what we've seen is that, and I encourage people to, look up the planetary boundaries for themselves. We could talk about that for 3 hours here, but we don't have that time. But we've passed 7 of 9 planetary boundaries, and passing those boundaries is bad. Like, that's in the danger zone. It's breaking down those systems. So 7 of those 9 systems that keep us alive are breaking down. That's not good. But our economic system ignores that, doesn't take that into account. And of course, that's foolish in the long run, because our economies are within our societies are within nature, the planet. We ignore those things at our peril. And so my journey was, and there was no kind of light bulb moment over my head of, aha, this is what I need to be doing. But it's an education over time of, well, this is the way things really work. This is what we really need to be doing. And so that led me to, we'll get into now, degrowth as an answer to the problems we face.
And I want to start that because when you discuss this such topic, degrow or post-grow, and we will talk about your proposition at the Arketa, and then you can tell us a bit more. Usually there is, I don't know, some people get like a reaction. Oh, those are the people that they don't want to grow, or people that thinks about that is you are proposing scarcity, or this works only in economies that are already developed. So can we maybe before going to your theme and your proposition as with Arketa, can you give us like a 5-minute or 5-second definition of the difference? So we have grow, degrow, post-grow, so green grow, all these things that sometimes they are mixed up and people use them maybe sometimes with mistakes.
Yeah. Degrowth is a rejection of the idea of endless economic expansion is desirable or sustainable on our planet, which, I kind of alluded to before. It's not simply a call for slower growth, but a democratically led shrinking of production and consumption aimed at achieving greater well-being for people on this planet. You can get a more technical definition, but that's generally what it is. It acknowledges the real limits to growth, because we have passed those planetary boundaries. I'll frame it in a way that I think Herman Daly, who's kind of the father of ecological economics, did very well. He contrasts things of an empty world and a full world. An empty world is we as humans, a relatively empty world is we as humans don't have much of an impact on the world. We're so small, we can't have an impact on the world. Think of, tens of thousands of years ago, we're hunters and gatherers on the planet. There's far fewer of us. We'll use up the resources. Like, say we can't buy a lake or a river. We'll use up the resources there. We'll fish there. We'll pick the fruit there. And then when the fish are gone, we're harder to catch, or the fruit is gone, we move on. Where the game that we're hunting is on, we move on to the next place. And that place that we just were regenerates because it has a chance to regenerate. That's a relatively empty world. Where we are now is we're in a relatively full world, where our use of resources is bumping up against and passing, in the planetary boundaries framework, the planet's ability to deal with that, to regenerate, to cope with that. And so, since we live in a full world, we need to live differently than when we lived in an empty world. And that gets into kind of the idea of people see degrowth as scarcity. And it's not really that. I'll give an example to show you. Scarcity, as I see it, is think of kind of a wartime economy is a good way to think of scarcity. Have we seen in the past? There's a big problem. There's a threat. We cut back on things. But you can't wait for those things to come back again, because they're going to come back again, like food rations during a war, or butter rations or bread rations during a war, something like that. That's austerity. Degrowth is a cultural change, realizing we have enough, and Arketa is the Greek word for enough. That's why we chose it as the name of our think tank. But degrowth is realizing we have enough. We have to live within those planetary boundaries, and a sense of focusing on sufficiency, like what we have is sufficient. How do we use that? And a good analogy for kind of describing that is, let's say you're a human being and your healthy weight is 175 pounds. That's about 80 kilos, I think. I'll try to get that right. So your healthy weight is 175 pounds, 80 kilos, but you weigh 225 pounds. you're 50 pounds, or I think that's 100 kilos. You're 20 kilos or 50 pounds overweight for your health. If someone comes along and takes away half your food, that's austerity. Someone else is taking away something from you. You didn't ask them to take it away. You don't want it taken away. Degrowth on the other side is you go on a diet. You realize you make the choice of this isn't healthy. This isn't good for me. I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to reduce my caloric intake. I'm going to exercise. I'm going to live healthier, have different habits. And so austerity is someone taking something away from you and you want it back. Degrowth is we can live here and be happy and sufficient with less. It's that going on a diet analogy. And that's a cultural change. We live in I live in America, the West, where we have too much of everything and we still think it's not enough. We're in this cycle of, over consuming and overproducing, and that doesn't make us happy. And so we still want more. Degrowth is getting to a cultural space where like, okay, that's not good for us. That doesn't work. It's destroying our planet. It's not making us happy. We have to work more and more each year just to get a little bit more of stuff we don't want or need just to keep the economy going. That's silly. I could say a stronger word than silly, but that's silly. Let's not do that. So that's kind of the difference between austerity and degrowth. But it takes a mind shift of people understanding to not want those things anymore that are bad for you. And that's kind of where we are.
I like the analogy because it's really explain and give the good image. Now I want to ask you, at the Arketa Institute, you are building, let's say, a new framework. So how does it work in practice? How, from the idea that seems, yes, I agree with you, Matt, how then I can put in practice? Which are the steps, especially for personal, but maybe even for businesses?
Well, yeah, that's the $50,000 or $50 million question, And the short answer is, I don't know. You can just stop the podcast right here. But the short answer is, I don't know. But the long answer is, I have an idea, or we have an idea. But it takes, this is a huge cultural change for our economies, how we live, our identities. That isn't going to happen tomorrow. That isn't going to happen next week. We didn't get here. I'll back up a little bit. We didn't get here to this neoclassical economics world where we feel that we have to consume more and produce more. We didn't get here overnight. This took decades to get here. But for most of human history, growth wasn't the thing we focused on as our reason for being. Like GDP, gross domestic product, is kind of measures our growth, and it's kind of the number that politicians and countries judge themselves on. GDP has become kind of a stand-in for is your country succeeding? It has nothing to do with well-being or health or education or happiness or broadly well-being. It's just, do you produce more stuff than you did last year? Do you consume more stuff than you did last year? That's all it is. We didn't live by that ethic for most of human history. It's just in the past 50 years or so. So we can't change that. Now, how do you change that? Well, how did you get from 100 years ago to where we are now? There's a lot of things that happen. And so we have to reverse some of those things. But to back up to Arketa, I thought of the idea for Arketa because I was in the think tank arm of CFA Institute, and I liked kind of that world of putting ideas out there, convening people, trying to shift the Overton window, if you will, shift the mindset of society, of what they should be focusing on, and doing research, writing, speaking, trying to move that needle on those things. And so that's what we do. That's what a think tank does. Our mission is to normalize the conversations about ecological economics in a post-growth world, in the world of finance, which is hard because finance is all about growth, to change this cultural landscape. But there's, we come across many people who in the sustainability world, the finance world, who get this, who understand, they're smart people. They understand how things are working or aren't working. But they have mortgages to pay. They have kids' college to save for. They have retirement to save for. And they feel that, well, this is the system I'm in. I know it isn't perfect, but we can't do something different. I'm on this kind of hamster wheel, if you will. And I've got to, if I don't do this, my neighbors will, or the competition will, and I will fall behind. That's kind of the trap the golden cage we're in, if you will. That's kind of the trap we're in. And again, that wouldn't matter that much if we were in this empty world where we had these planetary boundaries being breached. It was 200 years away, but they've already been breached. So we have to change this. We put out a paper last year with our Arketa Institute, kind of introducing these concepts to people in finance, and it was called By Disaster or Design was the name of the paper. Because by disaster or design, a post-growth world is coming. We've passed these limits to growth. Nature isn't going to let us grow forever, indefinitely. That's just not physically, you get back to the laws of thermodynamics. That's just not possible. So this will all collapse at some point. It's starting to collapse through climate change and other things, but it will collapse in a way we don't want it to unless we change things. So it's imperative that we change how things are done. Now, getting to your question of how do you do this, getting back to my I don't know answer, is I do know in a way, but it takes time to change cultures. I think it's more grassroots. It starts more at the local level. You're not going to get, a president or a prime minister to say, hey, we're going to be degrowth tomorrow. That's not going to happen. It may, but it's not anytime soon. And you're not going to get, leaders of corporations to do the same. It will take people not rising up in revolution, but, that may happen in some places, but rising up and taking control more of what's happening locally, organizing locally. A thing I see happening is more emphasis on bioregionalism and the bioregional movement. And the bioregional movement is just, I forget the number, but there's 200 different bioregions around the world. Think about where your water comes from, your watershed. If you live near a forest, what the forest provides, what the desert provides, what the river provides, what the ocean provides, depending on where you live. That is what we should focus on, starting with protecting that, taking control of that, understanding that, getting around the people around us in our communities, making sure the forest is healthy, making sure the water is healthy, those kind of things. Starting there is a way to do this. And as we grow more, I didn't know what my watershed was 10 years ago. I didn't know what a watershed was, 10 years ago, but because I didn't have to. I lived in a big city. It was all taken care of for me. But that's part of, we've been separated from understanding how close we are to nature and how intertwined we are with nature. So, once we know what our watershed is and know how to protect our forest and know how to protect our river, we do that more. And we don't let outside forces of the state government or the provincial government or the federal government mess with that. A great example here, I live in Virginia, the state of Virginia, United States, which is the data center capital of the world. More data centers are here than in any other state in America and any other region in the world because of our proximity to Washington, D.C. and just the vagaries of our political system. And that happened because people weren't really paying attention. People really weren't, citizens here really didn't understand the issues of the water and energy. And now they do. And there's a big pushback on those things. I wish that had happened 5-10 years ago, but it didn't, but it's happening now. So that's one example of that. And I think, and we talk about this in our paper, we'll get into this a little bit more in more detail a little later in this conversation, but changing the systems that we use, whether it's governance, our local governance or our governance in our states, provinces, countries, but changing our systems. Like the second paper we wrote the first paper I discussed about disaster design came out last year. And the recent paper we wrote, A Path to Post-Growth Pensions, came out this January, because we realized pensions were a third of all the world's assets. And that really gets to the question of, when someone says, as I said before, I understand these are problems, but I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got a retirement to save for, I've got children's education to save for. We live in a capitalistic society where we need to make more money to buy what we need and live and as we see thrive. Well, that's evolved that way over the past decades. That's not the natural state of nature. Capitalism, we admitted it wasn't here, hundreds of years ago. It probably won't be here in its current form 100 years from now. We'll be living under some other system. And I think people are seeing, the flaws of our capitalist system. that's, the gross inequality it engenders, the need to destroy our natural systems it engenders. So it's worked in some ways, it hasn't worked in others. Let's address the ways it's not working, and let's change that.
Mm.
And so in the pension context, just pensions are such a big thing. It's reimagining pensions. And the way we talk about it is there's kind of different capitals that influence our lives. There's financial capital, which is money, what's in your pension. There's also natural capital, nature. There's also social capital, your society. There's also, human capital, that's more labor and your work, cultural capital, and all these other kind of things. But in our lives, in our societies, and especially in our retirement, we focus almost exclusively on financial capital. Our pension system, our 401k here in the United States, where I am, we're encouraged, the image I use is we're encouraged to be dragons sitting on bigger piles of gold alone in our caves at the end of our lives. That's not any way to live. That's not what we want as human beings. Money's important. It's important to have money to be able to do things. But we've put money in place of care in a lot of ways. We need a huge part of people needing a lot of money in the old age is to pay for healthcare. Not that paying for healthcare is going to go away, but if we had societies and cultures where we spent more time on each other, with each other, and helping each other, that could move some of the burden off of the pensions. You needing to have that huge pile of gold at the end of your life. Now, we're all going to have medical complications as we get older, but there was and we cited this in our paper. I forget the exact number, but it shows the kind of the pandemic of loneliness and being alone in the world. And it was something to the effect of 25% of seniors in the United Kingdom eat Christmas dinner alone. And that really drives home the point that our culture has changed from one where we take care of each other, we make sure we don't leave people behind. We lived in smaller bands where we could do this much easier, over time, to something where we're just about accumulating wealth and resources, and you're on your own for most of your life. And so our argument is, and there's I don't know about this, is how do you get to there, is take focus away from accumulating financial capital, build your natural capital, build your social capital, build your human capital, and push for those changes from your governments and your businesses. It gets down to regulation and policy in some ways, where, well, our regulation and policy is tilted towards a neoclassical economics framework where our goal is GDP growth. Our goal is to have a huge pile of gold at the end of our lives. We don't focus a lot on natural capital, social capital, human capital. Take some of the time and resources we're spent on just growing financial capital and grow those. And that won't, we're not going to live in a utopia, but that will go a long way to ameliorating some of those problems.
And thank you, Matt. And while I think many of these things resonate, we have discussed with many people in the podcast the issue of capitalism, the issue of overconsumption, the way that nature has been framed as an externality in many of those here. So some people will discuss and say, okay, thank you. Yes, we agree with you, the boundaries and everything, but you are underestimating the humans. So they will say there is ingenuity at play, there is technology at play. So we can say that smarter technology, smarter design can really keep us growing, keep us building and booming while within our planetary limits. How would you respond to this side of the critic that is often, cited against your arguments?
Yeah, that's the green growth argument, that we can just make our growth green and we'll be okay. And I was there for, in the sustainability world, that's what I was trying to explore and say, and I was in that world of, hey, let's just invest more in green technology and that will make things okay. Over the long term, sorry, it just doesn't work. Again, it's just physics. We're at the limits of what the laws of thermodynamics will allow. Every energy source mankind has ever used is still being used. We haven't stopped burning wood. We haven't stopped burning coal. Everything we find is just added on to what came before, because we're growing and because we feel we need to grow. And so you can say, yes, the United States uses, and I don't have those numbers in front of me, but say it uses 60% per capita energy than we did 30 years ago. Yes, but we've grown a lot. So even though we're using less energy, we have more people and more processes, and we're things like data centers that are using more energy. So growth, you're always going to use energy. And so even if you're using it more efficiently, and I'll argue against that next, even if you're using it more efficiently, you're always going to use more. And there's a word for that comes, people may have heard, Jevons paradox. That comes from an economist in the UK back when coal was our main energy source. And he studied, the use of coal and steam engines and all that kind of stuff. And he found that once the technology becomes more efficient, you use more of it. So, and that counteracts and blows away any efficiencies you have. You can think the more modern analogy is fuel economy standards. Back when I was born, the fuel economy standards were terrible. You get like 10 to 12 miles per gallon in a car, right? Now you can get cars that aren't electric, still internal combustion engines, they can get 30, 40 miles per gallon per car. Well, you use them more, you do more. So you end up using more energy. So you have to have it in the system, whether that's policy, regulation, or culture, that you don't use that energy. And so again, those are long-term changes of a cultural change of, hey, I don't need to go, drive my car 2 miles away to the store every day to get, groceries. Why don't I go once a week, load up on everything I need, and then I have one trip? That's a cultural thing, right? But there's also policy things and regulation things that can help along that. Like fuel economy standards are good, but then you have to find ways to not use that technology as much anymore. And then there's also the issue of, yes, energy production or green energy is, more advanced than it was in the past. But oftentimes we're just offshoring that dirty production somewhere else. So if the United States has become more efficient, or Sweden or wherever has become more efficient in the use of energy, but the energy to produce those things is now in India or China, South Africa, or somewhere else, then it's still the same problem. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't care where it came from. If there's more of it in the atmosphere, that's all that matters. And we've seen that there's been a slight decrease in the energy. There's been a slight decoupling of energy around the world over the past 10, 20 years, but not near fast enough to address the problems of climate change. And there's been no decoupling of material use. People often forget material use in this whole process. They just focus on the energy, which is getting better, but isn't moving fast enough. It's still 80% of our global energy comes from oil and gas. And that's going down by about 1% a year. That's not fast enough. But material use is about the same per capita. And there's only so much copper in the ground. Every time we cut down a tree to build something, we're losing the ecosystem services, if you will, of that tree. The oxygen it produces, the shade it produces, the homes for wildlife it produces, it keeps the soil from eroding, it cleans the water that we drink or in our river. And so you have to take those externalities, if you will, into account. And we're just cutting down more trees. Trees is just one example. We're using more of everything. And so there's no decoupling of materials. So we'll figure it out. We're smart animals. Everything will be fine. Technology isn't an answer. It just doesn't work that way. We have to live simpler lives. And this gets back to austerity and degrowth. People say, no, but you're imposing austerity on me. And I would say, look, do you want to live? Do you want your children to live? What kind of world do you want your children to live in? Because it's a full world. We're past a full world. If this was an empty world, this wouldn't be a problem. But we are past a full world. And so we are destroying the planetary boundaries that keep you alive. So if you're crying to me about austerity, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, but we just can't live this way anymore. we need to change our mindset and our culture of getting to a post-growth world, because it's coming whether we want to or not. And it's coming in our lifetimes, whether we want it to or not. So we need to go on that diet, if you will, and embrace those changes and change those habits to get to a healthier place.
And thank you, Matt. And it's really compelling. And what I see is that in the conversation, there's a lot about discussion, but the train is coming, as you keep saying. So willing or no, it's there. And another critic that is coming sometimes from the global south. Some people criticize some other in another episode. They say, okay, fantastic. The growth can be framed maybe for the northern hemisphere, for the US, maybe Europe. But in places like Africa or maybe even China, sometimes it's taken like in a way like, oh, you want to impose to me austerity. Some people want to say, oh, we need to grow, we need to pollute, we don't care, we need fossil fuels because we need to reach at that point. So my question is this: how do you hold this tension? Because on one side, we have the imperative of people they want to grow that historically has been below consumption par with maybe the US. But on the other side, the tension is the train is coming. It does not look if you stay in the US or China or whatever or Latin America, the train is coming for everybody. So how do you hold this tension together? And which is your response?
Yeah, I mean, my response is just I try to be practical about any of these questions. But the global north, global south one is an interesting one, and it's the folks that need to go on a diet are the global north. It's not the global south. That's where you start. In the research for our first paper, I came across some data from the website Our Worlds in Data, and it showed kind of and you can get this information from a lot of places. The average CO2 footprint of folks in different countries. And I did some rudimentary math, and it showed that a family of 14 in India, your average, not every, of course, your average family of 14 in India has a lower carbon footprint than a family of 2 in the United States. So where's the problem, right? It's the global north. That doesn't mean the global south, should just, burn every piece of coal on earth. Of course not. But the real issue is the global north. If the global north got its act together and just for the sake of argument, had a goal of living like the average European middle class family, that wouldn't get us to where we needed to be, but that would get us on the way to where we needed to be, right? And then you adjust from there. So it's things like SUVs and private jets and fast fashion and eating a lot of beef and agriculture is a huge one. And again, the beef is a great example because it touches so many things. I'll just go through this really quickly. Well, it's ironic. India doesn't eat any beef, and we eat tons of beef in the United States. But so broadly, this is a global north problem. The global south should be allowed to grow. And historically, there's been all the colonialism and extraction that we in the global north have taken the resources from the global south. What if we just reverse that and stop doing that? And we have to live within our means in the global north, and then the global south can live within its means. And this gets into debt forgiveness and all those kind of things, which is a different podcast, which I think we should do. But anyway, like getting to beef is an example. It's throughout history, eating beef is a luxury, right? Mm. But it's so environmentally destructive. Not that no one should ever eat beef ever again, but it is very environmentally destructive. So if I tell you all this stuff, you have to use so much water for beef production. The reason the Colorado River in the United States is in crisis is the number one use of water is for cattle and beef production. If we not got rid of beef production, but if we just cut it back a little bit, the example I saw in the story it's a good example, is I grew up Catholic. So we had Lent, where on Fridays you don't eat meat. Mm. If you just had the whole of the United States not eat meat one day a week, you'd solve the problem of the Colorado River. because that's how much water it uses. It uses so much water, and we'd have to go back and look at the math, but I remember reading that in a story like 5 or 6 years ago. I was amazed. But it uses so much water, it produces greenhouse gases, yes, through the methane from the cows, but also you have to transport that beef somewhere, and that's the carbon footprint of it. We have to spend so much time on pesticides and chemicals that get into our waterways to kill, the bad things that harm the crops that the cows eat. We use something like a third of our land in the United States for either raising cattle or raising stuff that they eat. A third. And then phosphorus and nitrogen that are used to fertilize, those crops, get on our water systems. And that's one of the planetary boundaries, too much phosphorus and nitrogen in the oceans. And so beef production touches like 5 of the planetary boundaries. And we do far too much of it. Now, austerity is believing, I'm telling you can't have a hamburger ever again. That's not the case. Degrowth, looking at through a degrowth lens, is look at practically what beef production does to our society, to our planet. It's not saying you can't eat beef again. It's like, if you eat beef 5 times a week, what about 3 times a week? If you eat beef, 3 times a month, what about 2 times a month? That's what it is. And so the global north and global south argument is mostly a global north one. And it's, how do we adjust our way of life? The graphic is, or the stat is, we in the global north use about 4 Earth's worth of resources a year. And of course, that's unsustainable. As a planet, we use like 1.7, which is still unsustainable. But that factors in the global south as well. So the global south is using much less than 1 Earth's worth of resources. So we in the global north are the ones that need to get our act together and go on that diet.
That is very interesting, and it's really touching. I think also is the way it's produced. We had also people advocating for different type, especially industrial, let's say the industrial model of livestock.
Yeah, industrial farming,
yeah. So that is industrial farming. So if you have maybe smaller area that is grazing in natural, so that one, of course, has a much lower footprints and things, which is also something that can help. Yeah.
But that gets back to local. Like, have your food systems be more
Exactly.
local. Your agri-situated, and that builds power and solidarity within the community. Like, an example is, I see in the grocery store every winter, December, January, February here in the northern hemisphere, my grapes come from Chile or Peru. I don't need grapes, in February. I can do without them. That's fine. My kids love them, but we try not to get them because, just think of the carbon footprint. And then, from having to ship grapes all over North America and Europe from Chile or Peru, we don't need to be doing that. Food systems, because food is the biggest, our food systems are the biggest greenhouse gas producer and the biggest ones that, are touching a lot of planetary boundaries. Deforestation is huge for beef as well. If we focus on local food as much as we can, it really hits a lot of these problems.
No, exactly. I totally agree with you, because that is where, food systems, there are local food systems that are really also more regenerative, even can be a model for the global south, because I don't agree when guests come on the podcast and say we need to ban coal and fossil fuel. And it's like, there are possibilities you don't make the same mistakes. Of course, you can grow, but in a better way. Green grow, we know it is not the solution, but it can help. And one point that came out, the last provocation, then we go maybe in a bit of politics, and especially the US, because I want to ask you about this. Some people argued, okay, fine, but all these things, sometimes discussion about better consumption on other, grow, degrow, and it's like throwing a cup of water on a burning house. So they say sometimes it's not worth it in a way. So it is not this the debate that we do. And sometimes in the movement of sustainability and grow, we point finger. Oh, you need to consume less, you need to work less, you need to do less, which sometimes creates the opposite behavior. So that's, oh, you want to force me to do things rather than convincing me. So how we can respond to that side of argument?
Well, as I've been talking about before, this is a big cultural change that we're calling for, and we're not the only ones. We're just part of this movement, if you will, and that takes time and that's slow moving. But culture leads policy. Policy coming from our governments only happens when there's pressure from the culture to do that, to make that change. Think of, the civil rights movement or environmental movement or things that changed large parts of how we do things. And not just the States, everywhere. Culture leads policy. So the little bit you're doing, whoever you are listening to this, that matters because other people in your life see the example you're setting. If you have children, they're going to live that way. And I think there's been a couple studies, but there's two that came out last year, both in the UK. One was called the oat latte paradox, which is a strange name for it, and the other one was, I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it was done by a place called Whole Loop Labs and the London School of Economics. And the first one, the oat latte paradox, they surveyed people, and this was in the UK, but I've seen other surveys that do kind of the same thing. Most people want degrowth type policies. They want well-being type policies. They want our governments to focus on education and health and not growth. But they think they're alone. They think other people don't think that. It's always about 70 to 80% of people want this, but only 20 to 30% think that other people want the same thing. And the second one, the Whole Loop Labs and London School of Economics study, looked at UK businesses, CEOs, business leaders. So it's not just you and I, thinking these are problems, but business leaders understand what's going on. They want to live and work and produce whatever they're producing in a more sustainable world, but they think they're alone as well. And they think if they do this, then somebody else won't, or their competitors will. Their competitors will get ahead of them. And so everybody wants this. Everybody wants this better world. You're not alone. It gets to organizing locally, whether that's through agriculture or local governance, taking, bioregionalism. A great tool we're trying to do more of with Arketa. We've only been around for a year and a half or so, but we're trying to host different citizens assemblies around the world in different financial centers to start with. The first couple ones focusing on our pension work with pension funds but also pension holders and just people from society. This isn't working. How do you want this to work? Let's sit down and talk about how we want this to work better. And those deliberation processes or citizens assemblies or participatory budgeting, where citizens get more involved in budgeting for, local things. And a balance has to be struck. But I think we've handed over too much power to our representatives, who often don't represent us because, they get lobbying money from somewhere else. And so building those structures locally is what I advocate for. I'm trying to do. We're trying to do. And to tell people that when they think you're alone, no one else thinks this, I can't make a difference. That's not true. And it doesn't take 50% of people plus one to get these things done. Studies show that once we reach like a critical mass of, I think it's 20% or so of a population that wants something to get done and is passionate about it and organizes for it, it happens. And so we're not there yet on these issues, but we're moving that way. And let's do it by design and not disaster.
And thank you for that. I think is a positive, to see this and to see that people can unite. I really like the way that you put together discussing, seeing, and also get more power to the people that sometimes has been taken to the lobbies and others. And going towards the conclusion, I want to ask, how do you see really this post-grow discussion about this evolving maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, especially if you look at the lens, if you open the newspaper, you see ESG or whatever is in retreat, sustainability since in retreat, everybody wants different things. So how do you see the things moving? We will just be hit by the train, or do we still have chances to make some, conscious choices?
Well, we're going to get hit by the train a little bit, unfortunately. But I want to step back and I don't want to be too much of a downer here. I forget the numbers, but it's something like there's been 123 civilizations in the history of this planet. Every single one has collapsed. Our civilization will collapse. Now, before, I don't want to jump off a cliff or anything. Rome collapsed. Italy is still there. Rome is still there. The Babylon, go back in history. There's a great book. I forget what it is. It's by a historian, and it's something like, I wish I had it in front of me. But there was a time, I forget the name, but it's like 87 BC or something. All these civilizations collapsed, and he writes about it and what happened. Those places are still there. People are still there. It's our way of organizing ourselves and systems collapsed because it didn't work. It wasn't working. And so we are in some form of collapse now with climate change, an overshoot of our planetary boundaries. So we're going to get hit in some way by that train. So that's already happening. But we can control somewhat how severe that is. We can build a better system. There's a great quote from Buckminster Fuller. I'm trying to remember exactly. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So that can be, that was, the steam engine and automobiles versus the horse and buggy. It can be ideas, it can be anything. And so our current system, capitalism broadly, isn't working. It won't be here in its current form 100 years from now. But how do we change it? It may still be called capitalism, but it's not going to look the same. How do we change it? How do we organize locally together to push for the changes we want? And the ESG, thing, I've seen it go in ebbs and starts and waves. I've been in that world for 25 years. I've seen the euphoria of the PRI, and then there was a backlash to that. And then, people wanted to do more sustainability stuff and the Paris Agreement. And then there was a backlash to that. And that will go in fits and starts. But as I said up in the beginning, that sustainability ESG focus wasn't really getting things done the way we needed to get them done. And so I'm not too worried about that. I'm more concerned about organizing people, educating people about what's going on in finance. And people get it. People see it. 10 years ago, these discussions weren't happening. I've seen stuff about degrowth, in the FT and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Economist, and everywhere polite society discusses these things. And mostly it's to say, oh, we don't like degrowth. It's not going to work. But they would have just dismissed it as not being worth talking about 10 years ago. And I'm seeing it more and more places now. And I go out and speak at universities. I'm going to speak at a conference later this week when we're taping this. And there's more demand for that, and more people want to hear what we have to say and what others have to say. I would imagine 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, there's more Arketa Institutes out there doing this kind of work because there's a need for it and a demand for it. And people want to build that new system that Buckminster Fuller was talking about because they know this other one isn't working. And sustainability, ESG are in that old system and trying to make that old system work, and it's just not going to. And so we're part of building something new. And I would encourage people to join us, educate themselves, and learn, listen to things like this, talk to people out there who are having these conversations. If you're a student and you want to, look at these things, there's plenty of places to find information or classes or education. If you're a professional later on in your career, find these things, talk to us. I'm the only Matt Orsagh on earth. I can't hide. If you want to reach out to me, please do so. But it's just it's doing the work of building that system so that the collapse that comes, hopefully the collapse isn't as bad as it can be, and we build something better.
And fantastic, Matt. Thank you also for this episode. Thank you for a lot of food for thoughts, a lot of provocation and discussion. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have. Either we agree or we not agree. It's a conversation we need to have because the situation how it is will not be sustainable in the next 20 to 30 years. So the train is coming. We need to find solutions for that. So thank you so much, Nat. It's been a pleasure and honor having you on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. I had fun.
Are you satisfied after this wonderful episode? Let's continue together our sustainability journey.